Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to REBOOT, Westminster Open Lens, first attempt at helping people get restarted after the summer recess. This presentation is one of a series that will be looking at the year ahead and trying to help people to see beyond Brexit and perhaps understand some of the other things that are going on. It's part of a two-day programme, and anything up to 15, 20 different presentations will be out on the web by the end of the week. My name is Neil Stewart. I've been working in Westminster since the early 1980s. I was previously the political secretary to Neil Kinnock some years ago, and we work with most of the government departments trying to track the changes that they're either rolling out or that they're anticipating, mostly for management audiences. So, looking at the year ahead, the session 2018-19, of course, we're not actually in a parliamentary session of 18-19. This parliamentary session started in 2017 and is going to carry on right through to 2019. I was trying to remember if this is the first time that I've been involved in a whole year where there's absolutely no Queen's speech to set the agenda. So all the traditional ways of predicting the year ahead have been thrown out for the Brexit agenda. That doesn't mean to say we can't look at the things that are likely to happen and do something to try and predict the pace of change. We're meeting at a time in September when the newspapers have become particularly excited about the prospects of upheaval in the political parties. But nonetheless, there is an agenda that people can look at. But before I do that, I think it's worth looking back at what has happened since 2015, because the election in 2015 is the forgotten election. And in forgetting it, a great many things have been concealed. The Conservative programme for the 2015 election was an extraordinary document. If you had listed all the things that they were pressing on, the living wage, their determination to change corporate tax and punish those who weren't paying it to the full amount, the threats of gender pay reporting, which they then implemented in the July after that election, George Osborne's enthusiasm for elected mayors, George Osborne's promise of 3 million apprenticeships and a tax levy to pay for them, quotas of women on elected boards, and the commitment to, I think it's 0.7% for international development. If this had been the 1980s, that would have been Ken Livingstone's list, and it would have been denounced by almost everybody from the Daily Mail onwards. And the forgotten election of 2015 marked quite a significant change in the attitudes of the Conservative Party, and those changes are still visible today in the way that they react to all the corporate and social changes that arise. I think everyone remembers that in the early 2000s, when she was chairman, Mrs. May accidentally ended up calling the Conservative Party the nasty party. What she actually said was other people said that they were the nasty party. But that was the start of a long journey in which the Conservative Party was undergoing a significant amount of change. And in doing that, they were galloping onto territory that not only did people previously associate with the Labour Party and the Liberal Party, but that most corporates didn't expect the Conservative Party to pursue. And what had happened during the period of 2010 to 2015 was that the Conservative Party had lost patience with business. It's very hard to find quotes and references about their exasperation. George Osborne had one or two outbursts when he was frustrated that companies were stacking up cash and not investing. If they'd invested even a small amount of the cash piles that they had, then not only would George Osborne's budget have worked much better, but the budget that Ed Balls was proposing in 2010 would have probably worked as well. And it wasn't peculiar to Britain that this complaint was being made. Obama was complaining in the United States that the cash was being stacked up and being given back to shareholders instead of reinvested. So patterns of business had changed, and even the Conservative Party were becoming exasperated with them. On top of that, one of the big drivers of immigration was skilled workforces from across Europe. And when the Conservatives looked at what was happening in the workforce, what they were seeing was big corporations not investing in training and contributing to that skills gap, contributing to that high level of immigration and storing up social problems for the future. And even the Conservative Party was not prepared to put up with that. And they had within its ranks people like Michael Heseltine, who have long been advocates of training levies to force companies to reinvest in training and not just give them a free ride. And it was this sense that some parts of business had decided to take a free ride on Britain that became more and more visible in the populist Conservative press and in the statements of Conservative ministers. That's why I think some of the most interesting changes in politics are happening inside the Conservative Party and are likely to be the drivers of change. So in that small period after 2015 and before the car crash of the Brexit referendum, they pushed all these forward. Elected mayors, which used to be a thing that Blair was an enthusiast for, but Gordon Brown used to block. Talking about the living wage, pushing up beyond what was called the minimum wage, leaving some of the trade unions completely stumped, but articulating as an aspiration, not always legislating for it. Gender pay reporting, if any of you were at the Times Executive Summit on the 15th of July, when David Cameron got up and said, basically, that in the past, government was expected to legislate for everything, and we were going to change that model. What we were going to do was just force you to publish it, and you can explain. You, corporate Britain, can explain to the public and to your customers and to your stakeholders why you've got these gender pay gaps. We're fed up of taking the blame for everything that goes wrong in corporate Britain. That was the subtext, in the same way as famously years ago, Nuran Bevan used to complain about the fact that he was held to account for every dropped bedpan in the National Health Service. And so there was quite a significant change happened in that short period of time. And the Conservatives moved on to a much more activist social agenda, some of which provided the roots for a degree of populism. So when an issue breaks through now, they will move as quickly as any Blair government or anybody else did to set up an inquiry, to put it at arm's length, to say that somebody else is going to have to deal with it. And it's clear that corporate Britain has taken a considerable amount of time to adjust to that problem. And so I think it's worth remembering all of that. And then there was the Brexit vote and Cameron's very quick resignation. And then, which everybody should read, Mrs. May's speech in Downing Street when she took office. And that speech still referred to the Conservative Party that was developing between 2010 and 2015. Remember how startled people were at its commitments on poverty and on social justice. A lot of this was language that I could remember John Smith and others doing in the Social Justice Commission the best part of 25 years ago. But of course, Brexit then changed everything, and they moved through to a general election in 2017. And since then, government has basically been dealing with one issue, and that's symbolised in the fact that there's one Queen's speech and there's not going to be another one until after the 29th of March next year. So it's quite possible we'll be able to do a reboot sometime in April or May, because I'm sure there'll then be a new Queen's speech for whoever's in government and a new budget, and basically an attempt to reboot the whole political debate from where it is at the moment. But it struck me as quite interesting how much of the debate has lost perspective on the huge changes that were taking place inside the Conservative Party, in their opinion, up to the 2015 election. And those things are still there, those commitments are still there. All the changes in relation to being on one side of the argument on sexuality, on gender, they are not going to be left behind in that area again, or at least some of them are determined not to be. So if you look at what they've put down and what they've talked about, just racing across government, in health, after the disappointment in the Lansley reforms of the early 2011-2012, the government have committed to an extra 20 billion. And at the moment, Simon Stevens, the head of the health service, is working up how that might be spent and what might be delivered on it. And that, he's got 15 working groups, and that'll more or less coincide with the budget and the old autumn statement sometime in November. So that's the cycle that has been set on. On pensions, there's increasing anxiety about equity release. In the corporate sector, the fallout from British home stores and what happens to the big legacy pensions inside some big companies. And then the underfunded public obligations. So, for instance, one of the biggest funds is the university superannuation, and there was industrial action on that amongst lecturers last year. And there are a whole string of other areas in the public sector where there are going to be problems with the level of funding. For some time, I worked as a parliamentary officer at the Royal College of Nursing, and one of the delightful jobs I had was to explain to the Council of the Royal College of Nursing in about 1986 that the nurses' superannuation scheme for the 500,000 nurses working in Britain didn't exist. There is no money in the bank, there are no contracts, unlike the police pension scheme, which is a real one, invested on the stock market that's been making profits, or the local government schemes. The nurses' scheme doesn't exist. It's an actuarial calculation. It is a promise by the Chancellor to pay. The same is true for parts of the teachers' pension scheme. There's a historical reason for that. It's that the post-war Labour government still had some of the misogynist tendencies, which I think they're going to try and legislate against tomorrow. And when it looked at professions that were dominated by young women, teaching, primary teaching and nursing, they assumed that they would never get to pension age, or by the time they did, inflation would have done so much damage that the Treasury didn't have to worry about it. Well, that's all changed now. Social Security, the rollout of all the consolidation of the 6 different credits is likely to be quite heated this winter. There's already signs in the rising numbers of homelessness that some people are falling over the edge. The payments and the speed of payments are proving to be problematic. Whether those are teething troubles or not, they're likely to provide quite a number of explosions. On universities, which are a huge industry and one of our biggest exports, they don't like to talk about themselves in those ways. But you know, if you build a Nissan car up in Teesside and you export it, there's, you know, the government probably gets 2,000 or 3,000 of foreign earnings as a profit share from it. If you get an overseas student to come in from China for 40,000 to do a master's, you know, the earnings for UK PLC can be 10 times as much as the car industry, and there's 100,000 of them. It has been a huge boom area. However, the government has fallen out of sympathy with the universities because whole ranges of reforms that were promised in return for those big fees haven't been delivered, and the Vice-Chancellors are at the moment meeting in Sheffield and trying to work out what their offer is. But they have the advantage they can surround themselves with the trusty shield of the English aspirational middle classes who want their kids to go to university, and every political party is terrified to touch it. But The debt levels are rising, and the Augur funding review is due to report in November. On social care, a number of local authorities are being stretched to the limit. Everyone's been going back and forward since Andrew Dilnot's big report in the last Parliament. There were some suggestions recently about ISAs and equity release, but that is not going to go away. And the government have got themselves into a mess over inheritance tax. At some point there will be a transfer in that area, but it doesn't look like that's going to be any legislation for this coming year in Parliament. On employment, employment is very buoyant, but it's providing everybody with a puzzle over productivity and the fact that wages seem to be very flat and there are skills gaps, and some of that seems to be increasingly reflected in spending. On defence, again, there is a retreat from engagement. There are big projects underway, but it's quite likely that in the budget there might be reviews of a number of those. On the Home Office, it looks like there is some reversal underway of Mrs May's own hostile environment on immigration, and also the very tough cuts that were made in the police. You know, they've taken over 25% cuts in their budget. But again, it's not clear how those have been applied or that people in any party are happy with it. And on infrastructure and transport, we've just begun to see some of the big projects beginning to show signs of stress in relation to HS2, but there will be others, either from skill shortages or from the thing that everybody seems to remember or forget, which is that we've had a very significant devaluation since Brexit, and those increased costs of buying labour or goods from abroad are beginning to work their way through. Normally I'd be able to give a whole list of bills and green papers that are promised and white papers, and I'd be able to give you the government's weather report. Governments are notorious for managing to make October last, you know, a promise of something in the autumn, last all the way through to the following summer. And if something's promised in the summer, you're lucky if you get it by November. But so much has been stripped out to make way for any legislation that has to be completed on Brexit, and also to minimise the opportunities for any damaging rows. So a lot of the things that organisations are going to be dealing with are going to be coming out of the departments and are going to be in the course of the normal sort of movement of their organisations. So the year ahead is not going to be in Westminster. If you had to ask the Prime Minister what their focus was, we've got 2 weeks where we're clearly going to have dramas. I've no idea where we'll be by the 16th when they go off again for the conference break, but there are quite clearly significant manoeuvres underway, and I'm not going to pretend that I know how those are going to play out. But there is an informal EU heads of government meeting on the 20th of September, and whether or not the Europeans come up with a counter proposal or an intervention, I've no idea. Whether they offer a variation or a way out. I think for the first time yesterday I heard a statistic on Brexit that really made me sit up, which was Evan Davis on Newsnight reminding people that the British economy is the same size as 19 of the 27 countries put together. So that gives you the scale of the problem that is being experienced in Europe. So the conference season is then off to the September 23rd to the 3rd of October, and that's a solid 2 weeks of entertainment. But we'll see what comes of that. Labour's in Liverpool, the Conservatives in Birmingham, where there is a new elected mayor, and it'll be interesting to see how that works through. Then it's all to the EU summit on the 18th of October. After that, Parliament resumes. Philip Hammond will then be back at centre stage. I was trying to find the predicted date for the budget. I've not been able to see them giving a fixed date, but we're looking at the back end of November once or twice. I think George Osborne actually managed to slip into early December. But the budget and autumn statement will be quite a significant contribution from Philip Hammond and give us some sense of where they're going to go over the remainder of this Parliament, which is due to go to 2022. You know, we are only just into the second year of a new Parliament. There's another EU summit on the 13th of December, and then the next get-together is in February and March, by which time it's probably too late to change anything. And then we have the Brexit date on the 29th of March. And it looks as though that is going to dominate all the debate. We're still receiving more of the impact statements that are going to come out. We had the first batch. More and more of them are going to be coming out over the next couple of weeks, and the next ones are meant to be even tougher than the last. So a lot of debate around all of that. And people will have to wait and see what happens and how industry responds. There's something very interesting has happened around Brexit. People expected industry to be much, much more vocal, but why would they? I mean, Brexit is a difficult problem. It's affecting their decisions on investment, but these are the same people that are having to cope with, you know, 1,000,000% inflation in Venezuela if they're in the oil industry. They're looking at the impacts on trade of droughts across Australia and other places. They're used to dealing with outrageous fluctuations. And although Brexit as an economic impact may feel painful to us, it's quite clear that a lot of the boards of major companies that are on the London Stock Exchange are actually international in their outlook and are not going to engage. So for those of you that are old enough to remember, in I think it was 1982 or 83, when the head of ICI went to tell Mrs. Thatcher that unless she changed her policies, a great British institution was going to be in catastrophic trouble, that is just not happening. In that sense, it's difficult to talk about British business in the way that people do on television and on the radio and in the press. It is a completely different constituency, and they are not looking at the UK in isolation in the way that some of the debate is taking place. And I think that's reflected in the degrees of their engagement. We've done a number of events on Brexit. We did one in March 2017, and we did it on banking and finance, and we filmed it and we broadcast it. We had about 50 people in the room, but we had 1,500 online because they were not prepared to come out in public and be seen to be considering relocating, because JP Morgan had made some comments and Barclays had made some comments, and the roof had fallen in on their head about the fact that they might open an office in another country. And ever since then, all the business decisions are being taken in the closet. But even then, in March 2017, 800 insurance companies had already registered in Dublin. Virtually all the top lawyers who can are registering with the Irish Bar. Companies are making provisions to make sure that they can switch, as Panasonic just have, their legal entity to protect themselves. The contingency plans are beginning to roll out. And in the meantime, investment decisions are being held up. The inward investment flows would have Mrs. Thatcher turning in her grave, because it completely reverses the objectives of her entry into the single market. The single market was her and Caulfield's huge achievement in the 1980s, and as positioning Britain in Europe, one of the most successful moves that any British government has made. And it is an astonishing thing to watch some of the successors to Margaret Thatcher proceeding to rip it up. So that's some of the year ahead. But the other thing that is bound to happen is a bit like the fishing boats beginning to do battle off the French coast, is what Macmillan called events, dear boy, events. if the government don't have a proactive programme other than Brexit, which they don't, then they leave themselves vulnerable to all sorts of dramas. It's quite clear that a lot of people in the business community think that late September, early October could see quite a big reassessment of not just the pound, but a lot of UK investment decisions. And whether that will create serious problems, we have to wait and see. Northampton, one of the biggest councils in Britain, would be bankrupt if it was not backed by government. And a string of other local authorities are making distress signals. They've already had 25% plus cutbacks over the period, and they're being asked to take even more. And as one leading commentator, Rob Whitman from SIPFA, said to local government, that they shouldn't really expect any more money. It's quite clear the health service is going to get all the money this autumn. And for some local authorities, that may prove that they're not able to maintain their statutory obligations. I mentioned business investment falling. It's very hard to point it, but it's a bit like, you know, boiling frogs. It's happening at the moment. We can't feel it, but the effects will be felt further down the road if these kind of investment decisions are postponed, and it will affect the economy at some point. We've got the impact statements, all the points in Parliament that there may be votes on a deal or on a treaty, and of course Northern Ireland, fishing war, and then what I call character issues in government. Now, in fact, it's the SNP in Scotland that are dealing with character issues in government, and the character is Alex Salmond. But you can never underestimate what are the things that can suddenly explode and take the wheels off decision making and postpone decisions in the future. So that's the shape of the year ahead, and it's probably the most mono-topical presentation that I've done, and I've been doing these since the mid-1980s. It's Brexit in all its dimensions. Anything else that's controversial is likely to be pushed back. So that's my take on it, and I'm happy to take questions and have your contributions. But thanks very much, and hope you find that useful. Thank you.